What is the scariest story you know that is 100% true? Story 1. I would call it more creepy than scary, but my mom's friend had a small house and lived alone. She noticed some strange things. A batch of soup disappearing faster than usual, missing eggs, damp towels in the hamper when she hadn't used any, extra dishes in the dishwasher, and so on. This went on for months, and she thought she was just being forgetful. One day, she heard some noises in her attic and went to investigate. She found a makeshift living area, a small radio, hot plate, sleeping bag, pillow, and food wrappers. She called the police, who kept an eye on the place. They ended up catching a man trying to sneak into her attic window. He had been doing this almost daily, waiting for her to leave for work before going downstairs to help himself to food and other amenities. Interestingly, she got to know him and discovered he was down on his luck. She didn't press charges. Instead, she let him stay temporarily, helped him find a job, and he lived in her attic until he got back on his feet. A creepy situation with a happy ending. Story 2. My friend's boss bought an Audi A4 convertible when it was new and exciting. One of its features was the hidden pop-up roll hoops that only activated in the event of a rollover. A few months after buying it, he lost control of the car and slid down a steep embankment about 10 meters, roughly 35 feet deep. The roll hoops worked perfectly and he survived with just some minor cuts and scratches from the bushes. The car landed upright and he was able to get out, walk back up to the road, and call the police to report the accident. While waiting, another driver who had seen the accident approached him to check if he was okay. As the man approached, he asked if the boss was fine. When the boss turned around to answer, he suddenly collapsed. His neck had been fractured in the accident, but it only severed his spinal cord when he turned his head, leading to his unexpected and tragic death. Story 3. Junko Furuta was just a normal girl until she was kidnapped by a gang, purely due to being in the wrong place at the wrong time. She was horrifically abused over 44 days before her tragic death. Kiki Camarena, a DEA agent in Mexico, was kidnapped by the Guadalajara cartel and tortured over 3 days. His story is featured in the show Narcos, Mexico, but in reality, his death was even more brutal than portrayed. A consistent detail is that they brought in a doctor to keep him alive during the torture, ensuring he didn't pass out from the pain. Kellyanne Bates was groomed by a man who eventually tortured her over a month, inflicting such horrifying injuries that the jury at his trial had to receive counseling. Sylvia Likens was left in the care of a woman who, with her children and others, degraded and tortured her for months before she died. The Hello Kitty case in China involved a man and his young girlfriend who kidnapped a woman, tortured her, and then concealed her remains in a toy. Baby Brianna, tragically, was subjected to severe mistreatment from the day she came home from the hospital until she died. Baby P, a British toddler, also suffered abuse from his mother's boyfriend, with his back being broken in his final days. Unfortunately, such cases are disturbingly common. Story 4. Before my dad passed away, he shared a story from when he was in Vietnam during the 1960s. He was on a mission with another American and 5 South Vietnamese fighters to place seismic sensors in the jungle. They were 2 days into the mission when my dad and 2 of the fighters split off to monitor a nearby trail intersection. The jungle was unusually quiet that day, just the sounds of birds, insects, and an occasional monkey. They had been watching the intersection for hours and were about to leave when my dad saw something odd. A Union cavalry soldier in full battle gear, lying by the trail. The soldier had 2 pistols, a Spencer rifle, and a curved club at his hip. The soldier looked at my dad, smiled, and signaled him to be quiet before disappearing into the jungle. Seconds later, a group of North Vietnamese soldiers passed by, heavily armed. My dad is convinced that his entire team would have been wiped out if they had been spotted. He didn't mention the soldier to anyone until many years later. When he told his grandmother, she smiled and said, "You saw old Red Tom," referring to my great-great-grandfather, a Union scout during the Civil War. Story 5. A female friend of mine in college disappeared from a party about 25 miles away from our school. She had gone with a friend, but at some point, she was nowhere to be found. Phone calls went unanswered, and the police were contacted, but she remained missing. 10 days later, a homeless man found her crawling to a bus stop, begging for help. She had broken an arm and a leg and was in terrible shape. At the party, her drink had been spiked, and a group of men abducted her. She was taken to an apartment where she was drugged, mistreated, and kept in a small room. At one point, after being given heroin, she convinced one of her captors to let her use the bathroom. She managed to escape through a small window and fell from the third floor into a bush. From there, she crawled to the road where the homeless man saw her and called for help. Many cars stopped, preventing her captors from catching her again. 3 men were later arrested. My friend eventually returned to school, graduated, and became a nurse. Though she was traumatized, she found a way to move on with her life. She was only 18 years old when this happened, and none of us will ever forget it. Story 6. Many years ago, before cell phones, we used pagers. Someone would page you with their phone number and you'd call them back when you reached a phone. As an on-call technician in the audiovisual field, my pager would go off all the time. If you added 911 after your number, it signaled the technician to call back immediately. I was always busy but rarely received 911 pages. One afternoon, driving from Orlando to St. Petersburg via Interstate 4, my pager buzzed with a number I didn't recognize, followed by 911. I pulled into a truck stop near Plant City to use a payphone. It only took a few minutes. I asked for some change and headed to one of the 4 payphones on the wall. I dialed the number and it rang with no answer. Frustrated, I wondered who would page me with a 911 and not answer. Then I noticed another ringing sound. Another payphone 2 spots over was ringing. I hung up and walked to the other phone, checking the number on the phone. It was the same number on my pager except for the 911. The coincidence startled me. I asked the cashier if anyone had used the phone, but she said I was the only person there in the past hour. I left, still unsettled, and continued down the highway. About 10 miles later, I came across a massive accident, a 4-car pileup involving a tractor trailer. State troopers and paramedics were just arriving. I stopped to help, but the scene was already catastrophic. To this day, I don't know who or what sent that page, but I'm convinced that if I hadn't stopped, I wouldn't be alive to share this story. Story 7. The driver of one of the semi-trucks we received in trade passed away while inside the truck. The sleeping area is a bunk with a mattress that flips up to reveal a seat and a table underneath, creating a dinette setup. At night, you pull a lever, and the bunk drops back down for sleeping. Unfortunately, something went wrong, and the bunk flipped back up while the driver was sleeping, pinning him against the wall. He was unable to get it to drop back down and tragically suffocated. He was stuck for around 12 hours before someone noticed the truck had been parked for an unusually long time for the type of deliveries he was doing. The company that built the sleeper made changes to ensure this wouldn't happen again and recalled all sleepers of that style. Story 8. When I was a baby, my dad played on a softball team. It was a typical social team. Lots of beers, pizza after the game, and a family-friendly event. My parents were good friends with 2 other couples who had young kids as well. On one occasion, the other 2 couples left their kids at one of their houses. With a babysitter they were splitting. They invited my parents to come back for drinks afterward, but I was fussy, and my mom decided to skip it, though normally they would have gone back to hang out. It turns out my fussiness saved our lives that night. When the other parents returned home, they walked into a terrifying situation, a home invasion. 2 men had broken in, tied up the kids and the babysitter, along with her boyfriend, and were waiting for the parents. The men took the parents hostage, forcing the fathers to withdraw money from banks and clear out a grocery store safe. When they returned to the house, they took the lives of both families, including the babysitter and her boyfriend. Tragically, the children were also victims. The 2 men were caught later, and my dad attended the trials. It was the first time he ever supported the idea of the death penalty. Thinking about how close we came to being there that night still gives me chills. Story 9. I used to run the boilers in a DOE building. Apparently, at some point in the 1980s, 3 people were murdered over involvement in a big VCR theft. VCRs meant for the school system had been stolen from this warehouse, and it was an inside job. Something went wrong. The head custodian was found deceased, and later the bodies of the other 2 were reportedly buried in Monticello. But the word was, they had first been incinerated. In the boilers, I was in charge of operating and maintaining. There were 3 operational boilers and 1 that wasn't in service. I had no idea which one was supposedly used, but every time I fired them up, I wondered which one it might have been. But that wasn't the part that gave me the real chills. You have to clean the inside of these boilers really well. Otherwise, the fire won't transfer heat to the water very efficiently. With #6 oil, these boilers would build up a lot of soot. To clean them, you have to suit up in a protective suit. wear a mask, and actually climb inside the firebox. Many times I found myself staring at the burner, wondering what the panic would have felt like if someone had been in there. I'm pretty sure those people were not alive before they were put in the boiler, though. Once I was inside one of the boilers while another one was running. The valve isolating my boiler from the main steam line wasn't holding properly, and by the time I realized how warm it was getting, it was enough to send me into a panic. I had to lift myself up and crawl through a small opening with the metal becoming almost too hot to touch. That was definitely a creepy experience, considering the history of that boiler room. Story 10. Years ago, when I was 8, my family lived in a big, strange house on the edge of a small town. The school district was going through restructuring, so even though my brother and I were only a couple of grades apart, we went to different schools and took different buses. This meant I was the last one to leave in the morning and the first one to get home in the afternoon, which meant it was my job to make sure all the lights were off and the door was locked. One morning, I noticed the basement door was open and the light was on, so before I left, I turned off the light and closed the door. When I got home that afternoon, the light was on and the door was open again. I just assumed I had forgotten to take care of it that morning, so I went to turn off the light and close the door. When I got to the top of the basement stairs, I saw a large, shadowy male figure at the bottom of the staircase. I panicked, slammed the door, pushed some boxes against it, and then went and hid in my closet. For months, I didn't tell my family because I was convinced I had seen a ghost and thought no one would believe me. Then, about a year after that incident, my mom and her boyfriend realized small amounts of money had been missing for months, totaling around $800, $900, but never more than $60 at a time. So we walked around the house with flashlights trying to figure out how someone could have been getting in. It turns out some stranger had been climbing in through a small hole in the outside of the house, shimmying through a crawl space, and coming up into the house through the basement. Realizing that I had been home alone with him on at least one occasion was one of the most terrifying moments I've ever had. Story 11. This is a hometown story that stayed with me. It happened literally right around the corner from where I grew up, maybe a 2-minute drive away. Judy Kirby tragically caused a fatal accident, resulting in the loss of 6 children and 1 adult, by driving the wrong way on a divided highway in an apparent attempt to take her own life. She had previously been hospitalized for depression and had recently ended a relationship with her ex-husband's brother. There were also reports of her involvement in illegal activities, leading to fear of an imminent arrest. On the day of the incident, she picked up her sister's son, who was celebrating his 10th birthday. Along with her own 3 children, they set out supposedly to get a birthday gift. Instead, she went missing with the car full of children. A short time later, 911 began receiving calls about a vehicle traveling at high speed in the wrong direction on the highway. After about 90 seconds, the car collided head-on with another vehicle, which was driven by a father with his 2 children and another young passenger. The impact was catastrophic, completely destroying both vehicles. The only survivors were Kirby herself and the child who was a passenger in the other car. The scene was horrifying, and Kirby was eventually sentenced to 215 years in prison. Story 12. My friend had a neighbor who was a retired mechanic, living on a large property with a big front yard and a long driveway. He had a couple of old, broken-down cars parked by his garage, which he occasionally used for spare parts. One day, this neighbor started hearing strange noises from his front yard while he was sitting in his living room. Every time he checked, there was nothing there, and he assumed it was just an animal like a raccoon or coyote. But the noises continued. He'd go outside to investigate, only to find nothing. He even set traps, sometimes catching animals, but the strange sounds persisted. Then he started hearing what he described as whispering voices coming from the yard. This continued to the point where he started calling the police, but each time they came out, they found nothing unusual and advised him to stop calling unless there was real evidence or to install a security camera. One summer evening, unable to sleep, he went out to his back patio to smoke a cigarette. That's when he heard the voices again coming from the front yard. He quietly approached and was just in time to see the doors of one of his old, unused vans quietly shutting. Alarmed, he ran inside and called the police again. This time, the police arrived quietly without lights or sirens. When they reached the van, the door suddenly swung open and several people bolted from the vehicle in all directions. Inside the van, they found syringes and other drug paraphernalia, realizing that people had been using it as a hideout to engage in illegal activities. Story 13. When my dad was a teenager, he and some friends had been drinking and decided to drive on some back roads as fast as they could. My dad, slightly less intoxicated than the others, eventually insisted they let him get out of the truck. He and a girl got out, deciding to walk back to town while the others sped off in the opposite direction. Not even a mile up the road from where they had exited the truck, there was a very sharp turn. The group missed it and their vehicle crashed into a tree at an extremely high speed. Tragically, 2 of the people in the truck passed away instantly. The third person only survived because they crashed in front of a house where 2 doctors happened to live. Despite their immediate assistance, the survivor was left paralyzed, lost a leg and part of an arm, and spent 8 months in the hospital before eventually passing away. This happened in the 1960s when medical care wasn't as advanced as it is today. When I got my driver's permit, my dad took me to that very spot to teach me the importance of safe driving. It gave me chills knowing how close he had been to being in that truck. He told me that the driver's father had what remained of the truck displayed in the center of town for months as a warning to others. Story 14. One night I was out at a bar with a friend I was visiting in New Rochelle, New York. We went outside for a cigarette, and a car came speeding past the bar. The car blew through a red light and started going up a hill that had a curve. We watched as it veered over the center line and collided head-on with another car coming from the opposite direction. Both cars' back ends lifted up before slamming back down. The car that had been driving correctly caught fire. I ran inside, grabbed the fire extinguisher, and shouted to the bartender to call 911 and report the accident. My friend, a few other people from the bar, and I rushed to help. I had been drinking earlier, but the shock of the situation sobered me up instantly. I tried to put out the fire, but it was no use. The heat and fumes were unbearable, and all we could do was watch from a distance. The worst part, which still haunts me to this day, was hearing the woman in the burning car scream. It was the most heart-wrenching sound I've ever heard. The fire department arrived and extinguished the flames. The police took us back to the bar to take our statements. The next day, I saw on the news that the woman in the car was a young mother coming home late from work. She was just a block away from her house. The driver of the other car was a wealthy individual who had been drinking. He lost a leg in the crash but survived. I'm unsure if he served any time, as I left town shortly after the incident. I've searched for a link to the news story, but haven't been able to find one since it happened about 6 or 7 years ago. It was reported by Low HUD and Channel 12 News. Story 15. My wife had just arrived at her parents' house, where she was living due to her father's health issues. No one else was home at the time. Instead of going further into the house, she stopped in the first room, which was right by the entrance, and started browsing the internet. While she was there, her cat came into the room. This cat was normally very laid back, friendly with everyone, and never aggressive. He would even let squirrels pelt him with pecans without reacting. But on this night, he was growling and hissing, standing between my wife and the rest of the house. It was completely out of character for him, and it made her uneasy. Sensing something was wrong, she picked up her cat and left the house. As she stepped outside, she noticed a police car patrolling the street and flagged it down. She explained what had happened, and the officers insisted that she stay in their cruiser while they checked the house. To their surprise, they found the back door wide open, which was alarming since her family never left the door unlocked, let alone open. The officers later informed her that they were patrolling the area because there had been reports of a serial offender in the neighborhood. It was a chilling reminder that her cat's instincts may have saved her from something terrible. Story 16. Have you ever heard of a person so notorious that even those who shared their ideology distanced themselves from him? Oskar Dirlewanger was one such individual, a Nazi so feared and reviled that even other Nazis, particularly fellow SS members, tried to have him and his unit disbanded and arrested. Oskar Dirlewanger was a convicted criminal before World War II, having been imprisoned for serious offenses. When the war began and Germany's military losses increased, Dirlewanger's old connections, including Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, allowed him to form a unit. His unit, initially composed of poachers and later expanded to include military and civilian criminals, was tasked with rooting out partisans. In reality, they often targeted innocent civilians. The Dirlewanger Brigade, as his unit was called, committed countless atrocities across Eastern and Central Europe. Their brutality was so extreme that other SS units frequently reported them for their horrific actions. One infamous event involved trapping an entire village in Belarus inside a church, locking the doors, and setting the building on fire. Anyone who tried to escape was shot. During the Warsaw Uprising, Dirlewanger's unit was sent to suppress the resistance. Among their many heinous acts, they targeted a children's hospital, assaulting the staff and some of the young patients before taking their lives. Survivors were often found and subjected to further cruelty. Even other Nazis found Dirlewanger's actions reprehensible, yet due to his connections, he avoided significant consequences for much of the war. Thankfully, by the end of the conflict, his unit was dismantled, and Dirlewanger himself was eventually captured and brought to justice. Story 17. About 2 years ago, one spring evening around 9 or 10 at night, I was sitting in my room playing Xbox with my friends. I heard my family making a commotion by the doorway to the backyard, so I went to check out what was going on. I asked my dad what was happening, and he said there was something in our backyard. My mom, who's a photographer, was outside trying to take pictures, but her flash wasn't working. She was right at the fence trying to get some shots when suddenly the flash went off, lighting up the pitch-black yard. Right in front of her, there was a bear standing on its hind legs. The moment the flash went off, my mom quickly made her way back inside the house. Story 18. My mom didn't tell me this story for a long time, probably to avoid worrying me when I was younger. When my parents split up, I was about 4 years old. My mom, my sisters, and I lived in a small townhouse for a few years before moving in with my stepdad. While we were at the townhouse, my mom woke up in the middle of the night after hearing a noise in her room. When she looked, there was a man standing there. She gasped and got out of bed, unsure whether to fight or run to our room. Filled with adrenaline, she couldn't decide. The intruder ran out through the back door. When the police arrived, they found signs of forced entry. My sisters and I slept through the whole ordeal, and my mom didn't tell us the full story until we were older. Story 19. A group of girls in my friend's circle decided to go out for a night at the local club. They noticed a girl on the dance floor who looked really out of place. She was wearing sweatpants, a t-shirt, no makeup, and had her hair in a ponytail. She also had a backpack on, which was very different from typical club attire. The girl seemed dazed, and more concerning was a large man grabbing her and dancing inappropriately close. One of my friends approached to ask if she was okay, but the man quickly answered for her, saying she had too much to drink, and he was her boyfriend. The group was suspicious, but couldn't do much at that point, so they just kept an eye on them. Eventually, the man left the girl alone for a moment to go to the bar, giving my friend a chance to talk to her. The girl said she felt extremely out of it and didn't know the man. It was more likely that she had been drugged rather than just drunk. My friend grabbed her and made for the exit, but the man returned and angrily confronted her, even trying to swing at her. Thankfully, someone had alerted security, and they intervened before anything escalated further. The girl was still very disoriented, but my friends managed to get her out of the club safely. The frightening part was that, despite the bar staff calling the police, they said there wasn't much they could do other than be on the lookout for the man. There's a good chance he's still out there, which is really unsettling. Story 20. One of my teachers, who was also my preschool teacher and later my 11th EH grade English teacher, had an interesting life. Her mother was a famous author, and her father worked high up in the government. But her most intriguing story was one she told every year to her students. When she was younger, she was driving through a remote part of Arizona, while her boyfriend followed a few miles behind her on his motorcycle. As she was driving, a man in a Volkswagen Beetle kept pulling up beside her, motioning for her to pull over. She ignored him at first, but he became more frantic each time. She finally pulled into a deserted gas station parking lot, thinking something might be wrong with her car. However, she immediately got a bad feeling. The man insisted there was an issue with her headlight and tried to convince her to get out of the car. Just as she stepped out, her boyfriend arrived and pulled into the lot. As soon as the man saw him, he jumped into his car and sped off. Later, she found out that the man was Ted Bundy. She always wondered what could have happened if her boyfriend had been just a few minutes behind. Story 21. I attend a university outside my city, so I rent student accommodation throughout the year. The contract for my accommodation ended just before my final exam, which was the following week. I figured I could pull an all-nighter at the university library, usually open 24/7, the night before the exam to get in some last-minute revision. I arrived at the library around midnight, only to find it closed for emergency maintenance. At this point, my plan was ruined. I decided the best option was to find a hotel where I could study. The nearby hotels were expensive, but I noticed one that was pretty cheap for the night. It was a 30-minute walk down a dark, silent road. As I walked, I felt uneasy, but I saw the light of the hotel at the end of the street and thought, finally, I'll be safe in there. Spoiler, I wasn't. The building was an old Victorian-style structure, and no one was at the reception. After ringing the bell a few times, I saw a tall, strange-looking man staring at me from the top of the stairs. I asked if he worked there, and he said no, claiming he was just another guest. He began asking me a lot of personal questions, which I answered vaguely. He eventually went back upstairs, where I heard loud bangs and shouting. The reception staff finally returned, and I booked my room. As I made my way upstairs, I heard knocking on the door next to mine, followed by shouting. Soon after, there was knocking on my door. I opened it to find the same strange man. He asked if I was alone, and I told him that a friend was coming over in 5 minutes, which wasn't true. He then asked if he could come in, and I refused. He tried to force his way in, but I managed to shut the door. For about 10 minutes, things were quiet. Then I heard footsteps going to another room, followed by loud banging and the walls shaking. I later found out that the man was a suspect in a previous murder case and had been hiding knives and machetes, intending to harm someone that night. He broke into the room next door and tried to attack the person staying there. The police arrived shortly after and took statements from everyone. To my knowledge, the man ran away and was never caught. Since that experience, I've never opted for a cheaper hotel, no matter the cost. Story 22. Years ago, when I was a missionary in Brazil, my companion and I were approached by a man who spoke nearly perfect English. His name was Bickford, and although he appeared homeless and unkempt, he was an American who had been living in Brazil for about 30 years. He expressed interest in our teachings and asked for a copy of the book we were sharing. However, it was clear he was more excited about speaking English with 2 Americans than anything else. We met him a few times, always in public but somewhat secluded places. During our weekly meeting with the local church leaders, we mentioned Bickford. The bishop and others immediately recognized him and warned us to stay away. They said he was unstable and would periodically bother missionaries. Despite their warning, my companion and I continued meeting with him, as we found it hard to believe he was dangerous. Over time, Bickford began to show signs of being unsettling. He would randomly run into us outside our house, and there was an eerie vibe about him. One evening, he invited us to visit his house in the jungle, promising to show us the way. When the time came, we waited by the side of the road until he finally arrived, very late. He led us down a dark path through dense foliage. I was constantly walking into spider webs and barely holding it together, as I hate spiders. We eventually reached his house, which was a collapsed wooden cabin in a small clearing. The furniture was destroyed, and there was trash everywhere. As he showed us around, I noticed that every inch of the walls and ceiling was covered in chalk notes, frenzied, disturbing scrawls. The notes included phrases like, "Jesus will forgive me, but I have to stop," and "I did it again," along with dates. Most chilling were the names of children, accompanied by disturbing details. My companion and I were terrified but tried to keep the conversation light, asking about anything but the notes. Sensing the danger, we made an excuse to leave, and Bickford reluctantly agreed to guide us back. However, he insisted on taking a shortcut, which clearly led deeper into the jungle. We declined and retraced our steps, not caring about the spiders this time. Once we reached the road and felt safe, we were in shock. I was so terrified that I couldn't speak. We reported the incident to our church leaders and ended up moving a week later. We also left a warning in our area book for future missionaries to stay away from Bickford. Story 23. My 6th grade social studies teacher once told us the story of how she escaped from her father, who was suffering from a severe mental illness. It was one of those last days of school, where instead of teaching, she gave us crossword puzzles and other activities to pass the time. A girl in class had been talking about horror movies with a friend when the teacher overheard and asked if we wanted to hear her story. Naturally, as a group of bored 6th graders, we were curious and agreed to listen. The teacher told us that her father had a mental illness that caused him to snap sometimes. One day, during one of his episodes, he grabbed an axe and began cutting into her bedroom door. He managed to break through and was about to harm her when her mother intervened, tackling him to the ground. Her mother grabbed the axe and locked herself in the bathroom with the teacher's sister. Meanwhile, the teacher jumped out of a window and ran to a neighbor's house to call the police. She later told us that her father took his own life after being released from jail. It was a chilling story that none of us ever forgot. Story 24. A few months ago, I was working in a theater, cleaning up after movies. One night, after a film ended and I thought everyone had left, I went in to clean the theater. As I was working row by row, I looked up and noticed someone still sitting in the top row. It was dark up there, so I could only see the silhouette of the person. I felt creeped out but continued cleaning. I told the person that the movie was over and that they needed to leave, but they didn't respond. Given the area's reputation for drug problems, I started to feel uneasy. I headed toward the exit to get the manager, but just as I was leaving, the person said, "You forgot to clean up here." I quickly left and got my manager. When we returned to the theater, the person was gone. I have no idea what that person's intentions were, but it was definitely one of the creepiest experiences I've had. Besides that, as a history major in college, I know some pretty unsettling historical stories. One example is Rasputin, who was almost like a real-life horror villain. He survived a lot: poison, being shot, strangled, beaten, and even being drowned in a burlap sack. Medical examiners later discovered that Rasputin had actually died by drowning, as his fingernails showed signs of him trying to escape the bag. It's a chilling story of survival, influence, and eventual death. Story 25. I had recently broken up with my ex, which left me living alone in a 3-bedroom house that we had previously shared. This was my first time living alone, so I was already a bit on edge. One night, around 2 a.m., my dog suddenly darted off my bed and started barking furiously. I woke up and heard leaves crunching under my window, followed by someone tapping on the glass. I froze for what felt like 2 minutes as the tapping grew louder, and my dog continued barking like crazy. In a panic, I grabbed my phone and ran into the living room. I could hear someone trying to turn the knob on the kitchen door, slamming on it to try to get inside. Thankfully, the door was locked. I called my girlfriend, waking her up, and screamed, "What do I do?" She immediately told me to call the police. As I dialed 911, the noise stopped. But then I saw a man's face at my kitchen window. We made eye contact, and I nearly lost it. He started yelling and trying to get in through the front door next, violently shaking the knob. I finally got through to the dispatcher, who told me to stay inside and that a patrol car was nearby. The noise stopped after about 5 minutes, and I cautiously peeked out. The man was gone, and soon after, the officer called me to explain what had happened. Apparently, the man was very drunk and had mistaken my house for his own. He thought his wife had locked him out. I'm so glad I always lock my doors. Even though he wasn't intentionally trying to harm me, drunk people can be unpredictable, and I have no idea what would have happened if he'd made it inside. Story 26. Whilst driving from Morelia to Ciudad Hidalgo, Mexico, back in the 1980s, we had 2 routes to choose from: the National Road or the old road called Mil Cumbres, which translates to 1,000 hills. This road had so many curves that many people got motion sickness while traveling on it. One evening, on our way back to my grandparents' home in Ciudad Hidalgo, my grandfather decided to take Mil Cumbres. He loved the scenic views, and even though the newer National Road was available, he preferred this one. However, because most people avoided Mil Cumbres, it was mostly deserted, apart from the occasional small town along the way. As dusk set in, the road became increasingly isolated, with complete darkness falling over the mountains. About 45 minutes into the drive, it was already very dark, and I noticed my grandfather slowing down. Sitting in the back seat, I leaned forward to see what was going on. That's when I saw it: a huge tree log blocking the road ahead. Without hesitation, my grandfather quickly put the car in reverse and turned around to get us out of there. He hit the gas, and I was thrown back into my seat from the sudden acceleration. Curious and slightly panicked, I turned around to look out the back window. As we sped away, I saw men emerging from the trees near the log, holding flashlights and what looked like guns. The taillights were dimming as we got farther away, but the image stayed with me. It was a close call, and I shudder to think what could have happened if we hadn't turned around in time. Story 27. When we were kids, about 14 years old at the time, my cousin had a wildlife camera mounted to a tree near my uncle's cabin in the woods. The camera would take pictures whenever it detected movement, so we'd leave it there for around 24 hours before checking the photos. One day during a family dinner, some of our younger cousins were with us. We had a great evening, but since the cabin wasn't big enough for everyone to sleep in, the kids decided to sleep in tents behind the shack. However, throughout the night, we heard animal noises coming from the forest. Our younger cousins were so scared that they ended up going inside to sleep. The next day, a group of us, both older and younger cousins, went on a hike through the woods and passed by the wildlife camera. We decided to check the most recent photos, and what we saw shocked us. There were 4 or 5 pictures of what appeared to be a lumberjack with an axe, wearing a hoodie and covering his face. The photos were taken around 1 a.m., and it looked like the mysterious figure was walking toward our cabin. Naturally, our younger cousins freaked out and ran to call their parents. It was all part of a prank that my oldest cousin and I had pulled on them. Around 12:30 that night, we had sneaked into the woods with a radio we had borrowed from the cabin's living room. We had recorded a CD of wildlife noises using different YouTube clips, sounds that didn't make sense at all, like tiger roars and other wildcat noises, even though we were in the Alps. We played it on full volume for about 20 minutes. We also brought an axe from the cabin, and on our way back, I deliberately walked in front of the camera for some spooky photos. It worked perfectly, and the prank scared our younger cousins out of their minds. Story 28. The Van Ornum wagon train, a group of about 45 people, was traveling to Oregon in 1860 when they were attacked near Twin Falls, Idaho. One survivor's account tells the story of a 12-year-old girl who, along with her 4 siblings, defended herself and the younger children with an axe as they were overwhelmed by mostly Shoshone attackers. Tragically, she witnessed her parents' deaths during the assault. The group suffered significant losses from the outset, and for the next 45 days, the survivors made their way on foot, hiding and trading for food with local tribes, uncertain of who they could trust. Eventually, they reached Farewell Bend, now a roadside rest stop in Oregon. At this point, the group split up. Those who remained at the camp either starved to death or were killed. Those who left the camp, including the 12-year-old girl carrying her baby sister, began to starve as well. Desperate, they resorted to eating those who had died in order to survive. At one point, 2 locals approached the group, and the survivors, unsure if these men were friend or foe, sent a 14-year-old boy with them after they were offered fish, likely salmon. Unfortunately, the boy never returned, and the group pressed on. The baby eventually died, and just as the group contemplated eating her, they were rescued by Marcus Reno, who would later become known for his involvement in the Battle of Little Bighorn. Soldiers later found remains that were believed to belong to the boy sent with the 2 locals. In the end, about 15 survivors made it through this harrowing ordeal. Starving and dehydrated, abandoned by their scouts, they had been wandering aimlessly, hoping to find their way to safety. Story 30. About 5 years ago, I was living with my grandmother. I was working during my 2 years off before university, and my parents lived 45 minutes out of the city. With rent and car insurance being too expensive for a 19-year-old, staying with her was my best option. We lived just a few blocks away from a huge mall, and while the area was generally safe, it had started to feel a bit sketchy. There were small incidents, like a guy who once asked me for a cigarette. When I said I didn't smoke, he got aggressive, shouted at me, and even tried to follow me home. But that was nothing compared to what happened one night. My grandmother and I were about to go to bed when there was a knock on the door. My grandmother, who had dementia, was quite paranoid, and rather than checking the peephole, I looked out the window. To my shock, I saw a woman crouched in front of the door holding what looked like a baseball bat or some kind of blunt object. My bedroom was right next to the front door, and I had a window near the ground that opened outward just a little. The woman started trying to force her way in through the window. My grandmother was terrified, but her dementia made her want to approach the woman. It took me a good 30 seconds to get her into her room, lock her door, and call the police. The woman kept whispering that she was cold and just wanted to sleep inside. I had to yell at her, threatening to cut off her hand if she didn't back off, and eventually she left, though she circled the house for an hour, trying all the windows. Even though my grandmother called the police, they never showed up. Story 31. This happened to my mom after she moved to Los Angeles from Mexico in the 1970s. She shared it as a cautionary tale when I was 10, to teach me that you can't always trust people, even those close to you. At the time, my mom was working as a cleaner at the Omni Hotel, and she became close friends with another woman from work. This friend was very helpful, showing her around the city, and since my mom didn't have family here, she appreciated the companionship. However, there were red flags. Her friend was a kleptomaniac who stole things from work, stores, and even my mom's apartment. The friend's boyfriend was also bad news. He made my mom uncomfortable with his leering and was rumored to have committed robberies. He even carried a gun. One night, the friend and her boyfriend invited my mom out to a restaurant. After dinner, they drove around for a while and stopped to get donuts. The friend went to get the donuts, but while she was gone, the boyfriend tried to assault my mom in the car. When the friend returned, she wasn't surprised. She just laughed and told my mom to calm down. My mom managed to escape running through downtown Los Angeles. She moved to a new apartment shortly after, fearing they'd come after her. The friend never showed up to work again. It was clear the friend had only befriended my mom to exploit her and set her up for her boyfriend. Story 32. This story still haunts me. It's about my uncle, who lived in Newport, Tennessee, in the mid-1990s. One day, my mom got a call informing her that my uncle had supposedly fallen down the stairs at someone's house, hit his head, and died. It was shocking, and the chaos of arranging the funeral was overwhelming. I was about 12 at the time, and for reasons I still don't understand, the family chose to have an open casket. The left side of his head looked like someone had hit him with a shovel, a cinder block, and a baseball bat. The funeral director had tried to rebuild his face with some kind of clay. I still have nightmares about it. It didn't make sense. How could someone fall down 4 or 5 steps and suffer that kind of injury? But that's what the police claimed had happened. The problem was my uncle had been in jail at the time. He wasn't a perfect person. He had been arrested for something minor like a DUI, but he was a Vietnam veteran, a father, and didn't deserve to be mutilated. The police insisted that they had let him out of jail for one night and he'd fallen down the stairs. They stuck to that story, even though it was clearly impossible. My mom tried everything, contacting lawyers, making inquiries, but she was met with resistance at every turn. What's worse is that the funeral home was just a block away from the jail, and now he's buried in a cemetery overlooking that jail. Newport is a small, corrupt town, sometimes referred to as Little Chicago. It terrifies me that there are places where corruption runs so deep that even law enforcement is handed down through families, and brutal murders like this are simply swept under the rug. Story 33. I have never shared this story before, until recently when I opened up to my wife because of something strange going on in our new apartment. First, I want to say that I'm a rational person. I believe in science, in what can be observed and verified. But what I'm about to share, I have no explanation for, though I swear it's all true to the best of my understanding. My grandmother was sensitive, for lack of a better word. She would always know when someone was going through something, no matter how far away they were. She avoided ghost stories and never talked about her personal beliefs much, even though she was very spiritual. I believe I picked up whatever she had. I can sense what people are feeling, and I've always been able to feel things around me, things I don't understand. I even ghost hunted for a while in college trying to figure it out, but I never got a satisfying answer. I don't believe in ghosts exactly, but there's definitely something we don't understand. For example, we lived in an old townhouse on land owned by a man named Lee Masters in Carroll County, Maryland. He was a brutal man, known for his cruelty. He would assault the enslaved people on his land, and when they became pregnant, he would burn them alive in a limestone furnace. I lived on that land, and I even worked on the archaeological dig that uncovered the furnace, confirming the horrible stories by finding the remains of his victims. Growing up, I hated our house. My parents were going through a rough and violent divorce, which didn't help, but I always felt something there. It was like a dark presence that was always in the room with me, especially in the basement and my bedroom. I thought it was just a childish fear of the dark, but then my brother, who's not sensitive like me, felt it too. We both heard strange sounds, footsteps scratching at the door, heavy breathing. I had a recurring dream about jumping down the stairs into the basement darkness, climbing back up and doing it again. I don't know if it was sleepwalking or just a dream, but it happened every night, to the point where I started losing sleep. As I got older, it got worse. Lights would flicker, the TV would randomly cut out, and doors would open and close on their own. I'd see shadows moving in the corners of my eye. Objects would go missing and turn up in strange places. I started feeling like something wanted to attack me. Once I even had what I think was a seizure. I never talked about it, except with my brother, who eventually told me to stop bringing it up. We moved, not because of the house, but things got better the farther we got from that land. The new house still had some strange happenings, but it wasn't as heavy. Over time, things stopped happening as I moved further away. Recently, I became a property manager and moved into an apartment where the woman before me had died from an opioid overdose. Her dog had to eat part of her face to survive. When I moved in, I felt that presence again, not as heavy as before, but it was there. I told myself to ignore it and it would go away. My wife, without knowing what I was feeling, spoke to the woman, thanking her for the apartment and telling her to move on. Afterward, she found a plastic bag under the heater filled with bloody gauze pads, probably from the woman's drug use. Since then, the feeling has grown stronger. I've never seen the woman directly, but I can sense her, almost like a smell on my skin. It's the same feeling I had as a child, but now I'm older, and it still terrifies me. I don't know what this is. I think I have whatever my grandmother had, but I have no explanation. Is it something like a radio signal that some people pick up on? Is it related to places where negative things happened, like this apartment? Why do I feel nothing from happy places? I feel like I'm going crazy even typing this. But if you can't share your insanity on the internet, where can you? And if anyone else has ever experienced something like this, please reach out. Story 34. We were on a family vacation at these beautiful lake cabins, a fun campground we went to every summer. My mom, youngest brother, who was 4 at the time, and I, 5 years old, went to the store to get food for the week, while my dad and older siblings unpacked and docked the boat. The store was about a 30-minute drive into town, and it had started raining on the way there. By the time we arrived, it was pouring. We rushed into the store and started shopping. We were in the cereal aisle when it suddenly sounded like a train was approaching. My mom grabbed my brother and me, jumped on top of us, and we had no idea what was happening. Cereal boxes were flying everywhere. The windows shattered, and the lights went out. The entire cereal shelf fell into the next aisle. An F3 tornado had ripped right through the grocery store. People were injured, but thankfully, no one was seriously hurt or killed. Ambulances arrived, and everyone was checked out. Amazingly, our car was undamaged. After about 2 hours, we were cleared to leave and headed back to the lake. When we arrived, my mom started crying. She had held it together until then, but seeing my dad and siblings casually swimming in the lake, having no idea what had happened, brought her to tears. We explained everything, and after deciding it was safe, we stayed at the lake for the week. The lake had shelters in case of more storms, and it didn't rain once the rest of the week. My parents later drove to the town to see the damage. It was completely destroyed, but by the next summer the town had rebuilt. Story 35. In December 1948, an unidentified man was found on Somerton Beach in Australia. His clothing was stitched with an unusual orange thread that wasn't sold in Australia. In his pocket was a note that read, "Tamam shud," which means finished, or the end in Persian. 6 weeks later, an unclaimed suitcase was found in the Adelaide train station. It contained clothes stitched with the same orange thread, and all the clothing seemed to belong to the unidentified man. This discovery, however, brought no new leads. Months later, a man came into a detective's office with a copy of the same book that the "Tamam shud" phrase had been ripped from. The man said that in December of 1948, he and his brother visited Somerton Beach, and when they returned to their car, they found the book lying on the ground. Inside the book were a phone number and a strange unlisted number. The phone number led to a young nurse, but when she was shown a cast of the Somerton man's face, she nearly fainted. The nurse claimed to have never known the man, though she had given a copy of the same book to a man named Alfred. However, when the police followed up on this lead, Alfred was alive and well, and still had his copy of the book. The police examined the book they found on the beach under a black light, revealing a strange code inside. To this day, no one has been able to crack it. Story 36. My freshman year of college, I had a roommate who was really into drugs. He never did them in front of me, but I knew something was going on. He would always say he was going fishing, but there were no fishing spots within 30 miles, so it was pretty clear he was up to something else. He even carried a fishing rod for show. One day, he said he was going fishing with some friends and left. About 20 minutes later, there was pounding on our dorm door. 2 guys were carrying him back, unconscious, and dumped him on the floor, warning me not to tell the RA because he was already on probation. I dragged him onto the couch and tried everything to wake him up, pouring water on him, shaking him, but nothing worked. Finally, I called campus police and ran to get the RA. When the police arrived, they quickly realized he didn't have a pulse and started trying to resuscitate him. The small living room was packed with people trying to save him. After a tense few minutes, they finally revived him. When he woke up, he was still out of it and started shouting and swearing at everyone around him. The cops told me that if I hadn't acted as quickly as I did, he would have died. He was expelled from college, and that was the last time I saw him. About 5 months later, I got a text from him saying I'd ruined his life and that I would pay for it. 6 years have passed, and he hasn't come after me, so I think I'm in the clear. Story 37. I work for a museum in what is supposedly one of the most haunted towns in America. There's an old, abandoned asylum that's currently being used by university staff. There's an urban legend about a stain on the concrete in one of the rooms. People talk about it, but I thought it was just a story until I actually saw it. As part of the museum staff, I help with asylum tours, giving people a glimpse of the town's history. Since I'm part of the team, I sometimes get access to areas the general public doesn't. Turns out the stain is real and it's massive. At first I thought it was just water damage, but it wasn't. Back in the early 1900s, a young woman who was a patient went missing during the middle of winter. The staff assumed she would return because she had nowhere else to go, but she never did. It wasn't until early March, when the weather warmed, that people began noticing a strange smell coming from a section of the asylum that was closed off for construction. They found her body there, arms crossed, and she had been decaying for months. Her body fluids had seeped into the concrete, leaving behind a permanent stain. At first, I thought it was just a creepy tale for college students to share, but the museum has documents, photographs, and records of this poor woman. It's unsettling because I have to enter that room sometimes, and the stain is always there. Story 38. My father was a hunter, a mason, and owned his own business. He taught me many life lessons, but one day he told me we were going hunting on a Wednesday, which was odd. We never went on school days, and he always made me keep my grades up to go. I secretly hated hunting but didn't tell him because of his expectations. This time, something felt wrong. I remember that morning clearly. As we drove in the dark, I had a sinking feeling in my stomach. I kept wondering why we were hunting on a school day, and why my dad kissed my mom goodbye like it was the last time. I also noticed he wasn't wearing his Masonic ring, which he always wore. When we got to the hunting spot, my dad mentioned we had the whole place to ourselves because he rented some land. It was dark and cold. We waded through water covered in ice, and I stayed behind him so he could break the ice as we walked. As the sun started rising, the birds began flying and my dad started shooting. He got one and told me to retrieve it. Just as I turned, I heard a gunshot. I spun around to see my dad running, holding his coat over his chest. He dropped his shotgun and fell to the ground. He said he had been shot, and I didn't know what to do. I tried to help, but he couldn't speak. He was breathing lightly, and I panicked. I ran for help, but got lost. Eventually, I found someone. But by the time help arrived, it was too late. I knew my dad was gone when my uncle came to get me at the hospital. I was 12 then, and now at 60, I still have nightmares about that day. Story 39. We used to live close to a CID, Police Investigation Department, like the Pakistani FBI building, though we didn't know it at the time. We always thought it was just an ordinary government office until November 11th, 2010. That evening, I decided to hit the gym, which was about a 10-minute walk away. I left for the gym and had only walked about 0.1 miles when I suddenly felt the ground shake for a split second. Immediately after, I heard the loudest bang I've ever heard, followed by a pressure wave that hit my chest hard. The explosion was so powerful it made my ears bleed. I was disoriented and covered in dirt. Every car alarm around me went off, and anything made of glass had shattered for miles. As I tried to make sense of what happened, I began smelling gunpowder and something that reminded me of burnt BBQ. Dust and debris rained down, and to my horror, I realized it wasn't just dust. There were pieces of human skin and flesh landing on me. As I got closer to the site of the explosion, I saw a 10-foot wide crater where the CID building used to stand. The place was a scene from a nightmare. Cars were on fire, people were screaming, and bodies were scattered everywhere. I saw a young man, maybe 18 or 20, lying dead on the ground, staring directly at me. His feet were twisted in the wrong direction. I'll never forget that image or the smell of burning flesh. For weeks after, I would wake up in the middle of the night screaming and see that young man standing in my hallway just staring at me. His image haunts me to this day, along with the sound of that explosion and the devastation it caused. Story 40. When I was 18, I met a 31-year-old man on Facebook. He was ex-military, having done 2 tours overseas, worked for a well-known area farmer, and was the son of a Methodist preacher. Based on all this, I thought I had found the one. Looking back, there were so many red flags that I should have noticed, but I ignored them. He came to meet me a week or 2 after our initial Facebook conversation, and after a few beers, I ended up sleeping with him. He took me home, met my mom, and hung out for a few more hours. I remember asking him afterward if I was the youngest girl he had slept with in his fancy pickup truck setup with its sleeping bag and blanket. He told me no. At the time, that didn't seem concerning, but in hindsight, it should have. Fast forward a couple of months, and he meets my best friend, who was still a minor at the time. He got close to her, and before long, they started sleeping together. I was crushed, but somehow, I convinced myself that since he wanted her, and she wanted me, yes, in both a sexual and romantic way, we could all form one big happy couple and have what we wanted. However, things changed. He started spending more time with her and less with me, which made me increasingly jealous. My best friend wasn't herself anymore, and eventually he disappeared from my life altogether. Assuming he was just with her, I cut all ties with her, heartbroken. In February of 2015, after 9 days of zero communication from him, I texted him saying, "You've made no effort to contact me in 9 days. I think we're done here." His only response was, "Oh." The following month, he was arrested by the local sheriff's department on a drug charge. A few weeks later, it came out that they were also collecting evidence for a human trafficking case. That explained why I'd been seeing the same black car everywhere I went. They were KBI detectives monitoring me. One of the officers was even the best man in my mom and stepdad's wedding. My ex-boyfriend took a plea deal and is now in prison on charges of distributing and producing child pornography. As it turned out, he had been keeping 5 girls around my age locked in an abandoned barn during the dead of winter. One of those girls was my best friend. I later found out that he had been injecting my best friend with drugs and sneaking men into her room to assault her while she was barely conscious. She never told me what was happening because she didn't want to hurt me, knowing how much I loved him. If I ever see this man again, I don't know how I'd stop myself from wanting to hurt him. He destroyed so many lives. Hindsight is 20/20ths, and only now can I talk about it without breaking down in anger and tears. I cannot believe how blind my love for him made me to the signs that were there all along. I thank God every day that I wasn't able to get pregnant during the time we were trying, and I'm eternally grateful that my best friend survived the unimaginable hell she went through. Be careful who you accept friend requests from, even if they seem harmless and are just from someone a town or two away.